Hello and welcome to this fireside conversation at the Forum of the Americas, Conférence de Paris, entitled Partnering for Impact. My name is Charlotte Reed and I'm France correspondent for CNBC International. The Rockefeller Foundation is an American philanthropy established more than a century ago in 1913 by the Rockefeller family in New York. By the 1920s, the Rockefeller Foundation had become the largest philanthropic enterprise in the world. Since that time, the foundation has provided over $22 billion in program initiatives in today's dollars. Today, the foundation's endowment sits at over $6 billion to support thousands of organizations and individuals worldwide. The Rockefeller Foundation has been involved in public health from the beginning, from its very first grant to the American Red Cross to helping discover the yellow fever vaccine in the 50s to the fight against COVID-19 now. While it is still involved today in this whole variety of projects to achieve health for all, it is also involved in projects to tackle energy poverty and expand economic opportunities, which we'll discuss more in details in this conversation. Now, let me introduce my guest, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Dr. Rajiv Shah, who joins us today. He is a physician and health economist who served as the 16th administrator of the United States Agency for International Development from 2010 to 2015. And prior to his appointment at USAID, Dr. Shah served as chief scientist and undersecretary for research, education, and economics at the United States Department of Agriculture, where he created the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. Dr. Shah, thank you so much for joining this conversation. Well, I'm speaking to you from my little desk in London. You are in New York, and we're both speaking at a conference in Paris. So this is very much the flavor of our time, what we've been through in the past 18 months. So we were just starting to talk about the recovery in the past few months. You were at COP26 yourself in Glasgow, where we talked about the climate emergency. It seems that the pandemic is catching up a little bit with us, with the news this weekend, of course, of this new Omicron variant and the concerns attached to it. But let me ask you first a very broad question of, have we learned any lessons from the pandemic in terms of international cooperation and lessons that we can use to deal with other global crises like climate change, for example, if we've learned any?
Well, Charlotte, it's great to be with you, and thank you for having me. I do think we are relearning basic lessons. One basic lesson I think we learned most notably after World War II, when we created the United Nations and created the Bretton Woods institutions and the international architecture for multilateral cooperation, and that is that our safety, our security, and our welfare are intricately intertwined with each other, no matter where on this planet we find ourselves. And that is a lesson that, arguably had been a defining feature of international cooperation until just after 2015. And then with the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement, with a reduction in funding for global development cooperation, with the Brexit in the UK, you could argue that we started to go rapidly in the other direction. And COVID-19 hit at a time when the desire and the mechanisms for cooperating together to solve big global problems were really being threatened. And so we are relearning the lesson that we're all in it together. And that is why we have to vaccinate everyone on the planet, not just everyone in wealthy countries. Otherwise, we will continue to see new variants that will respect no boundaries, and certainly not respect the boundaries between richer communities and those that are least well off. It's why climate change is such an urgent problem that requires real global cooperation to address. And the COP meeting was important that it happened. There were some real steps forward, but not nearly enough to achieve a basic level of human protection for everyone on the planet. And so in this moment, we are slowly relearning lessons that we have to relearn very quickly. And we need much, much bolder action at the federal level, public and private, in order to tackle the challenges we face as a common humanity.
And it really feels that the current situation that we have now with this Omicron variant that emerged is really showing that to some extent we've failed to learn some of these lessons, that no one is safe until everybody's safe. And, we're on third doses of the vaccine in some rich countries, where we're failing to give the vaccine to poorer countries. So to some extent, there's still a lot that we really need to learn from this pandemic lesson, really.
Well, the pandemic actually has highlighted the tremendous ingenuity and innovation that can exist within the private sector and that can be nurtured in true public-private partnership. Operation Warp Speed in the United States, for example, helped accelerate the development of these vaccines and enabled companies to hit markets much, much faster than they otherwise would, and really should be recorded as a huge success story. At the same time, we set two targets for much of the rest of the world outside of wealthy nations. One was to achieve 40% immunization coverage by the end of this year, and the other was to achieve 70% and therefore herd immunity by September of next year. Neither of those are going to be achieved through current efforts. And that's exactly why we have this dangerous new variant disrupting global markets and global economies and lives around the world. And, our Rockefeller experts have estimated that new variants are 6 to 8 times more likely to come from lesser developed countries, because that's where viral replication continues to occur at a very, very high rate because immunization has been so slow. And I frankly wish the companies that are involved here, Pfizer, Moderna, and others, would do more to make their products available either through partnership with local manufacturers or through true tiered pricing arrangements that could allow developing countries to access those products in the right terms much faster. It's in everybody's national interest to serve other countries right now.
And another time where we've talked a lot about this public-private partnership was, of course, COP26 in Glasgow, where you attended yourself, I believe. Very bluntly, do you see COP26 as a success or a failure?
Well, I do see it as a success because I believe in multilateral and global cooperation. And I think these venues are required to bring people together and let's do practical things that will make a real difference. I'll give you just one example. The Rockefeller Foundation was able to launch a global energy alliance for people and planet. We were able to aggregate $10.5 billion in financial commitments from multilateral development banks. Other philanthropies, the Bezos Earth Fund and the IKEA Foundation are just two of the many others that are joining this effort. Countries like the government of Italy and so many other partners. And that effort will, over time, move 1 billion people out of poverty by expanding access to renewable electricity in 60 or 70 countries to reach that community. It will reduce by 4 billion metric tons carbon emissions from development pathways that would otherwise favor coal, which is still on the rise globally, primarily in the developing world. And it'll create 150 million new green jobs in countries that are starved for job opportunities for their very young populations. So these are the kinds of efforts, public and private, results-oriented, innovative, and global, that we need if we are going to tackle climate change and do it in a way that lifts up everybody, not just those who are already well off. And I hope that future COPs will generate more of these initiatives and hold us to account to deliver the results we've committed with this one.
So this Global Energy Alliance that you launched at COP26 is to accelerate investment in green energy transition in developing and emerging economies. So what kind of project are we looking at here that would involve people like you, the private sector, potentially governments and the private sector? What kind of scale and kind of project that would mean?
Well, we're already underway in about a dozen countries around the world, and that will rapidly expand. One example is a partnership with the Tata Power Group in India to provide rural off-grid solar electrification to 10 million people who currently don't really have access to electricity. They have government power a couple hours a day and erratic at that. And we've shown that, by using this new renewable energy technology with smart meters, with artificial intelligence-based battery and energy management systems, and with real efforts to get energy storage costs down to make it affordable, we can provide power to them on an always-on, totally reliable basis for 20 to 22 cents a kilowatt hour, and that'll come down to 15 cents in the coming year. So that kind of an effort is already serving millions of people. It will will expand dramatically. A similar effort in the Democratic Republic of Congo will electrify 25 small cities and help those communities get access to productive energy for the first time in a meaningful and reliable way. Our effort in Indonesia will help decommission coal plants while also building out solar electrification, specifically in the country that's hosting the next G20, so that the world leaders can come and see what progress can really look like. All these efforts require real public-private cooperation. No one sector can do it on its own. And that's why we brought everyone together to say, let's cross this divide. Let's work together. Let's make this happen, because this is an urgent fight to save our planet, but it's also, and has to be, an on-ramp for real human opportunity for those who are otherwise left behind.
Because I've read that you mentioned that energy access is the number one constraint to growth and opportunity. So the question really is, how do you get countries to embrace and accept the change, the way, in a way that benefits them, especially when a lot of their people actually don't even have energy as it is? So how do you make them embrace this change, right?
Well, the good news is we don't have to make them embrace the change. They know that the form of electrification that they've been trying to implement for the last 50, 60 years has simply left out a lot of their population. And even though there's some financing from certain countries to make coal, for example, very inexpensive, you still have to build transmission lines and reach people in rural communities or urban slums. Everyone knows that energy access, reliable, low-cost energy access, is the number one constraint to growth in country after country. And everyone knows that if you don't have the power to charge your phone and turn a light on in your home, or build a small business and use power tools to increase productivity, you're simply not going to be able to join the modern economy. And there's still 1 billion people on this planet that live outside of having that kind of access to power. So we find that we don't have to convince anybody. What we have to do is bring people together, public and private, and say, okay, you might have to change some public sector regulations. You may have to cut back on inefficient and often corrupt subsidies to fossil fuel generation facilities, and you have to invest in a different approach on the public side. And by the way, we need private companies standing with public governments to help implement the way Tata is implementing in India, and the way our partners in the DRC and Nigeria and Indonesia are all working there, so that people can see progress on the ground and be served quickly. And have faith that public-private partnership can work. So we haven't found that convincing folks is hard. What's hard is getting public and private to work together. And that is something the Rockefeller Foundation has been doing, as you point out, for a very long time, since the 1920s.
And you have mentioned before that one of the hurdles in bringing the private sector in, of course, is a notion of taking risk. That they used to be more risk averse a few years ago, but it seemed like things are changing and they're a little bit more willing, this private sector, to take some risk on. Of course, your role here is key in taking that initial risk and then bringing them in. So how does that work? Do you see really this evolving in the good direction?
Well, I do, but I see it evolving because we, the philanthropic civil society institutions and sometimes donor governments, are willing to take the risks. Of the $10.5 billion I mentioned, $1.5 billion of that is pure grant capital from philanthropies, from ourselves, Bezos Earth Fund, and the IKEA Foundation. And what that allows us to do all the planning work. It allows us to test whether certain strategies work or don't work. It allows us to help take risk out of the system for private developers and private companies. And that ultimately makes it safer for them to invest their time, effort, energy, operating capability, and technology to serve communities that would otherwise go unserved. And, this is one example of an effective public-private partnership with a huge ambition for the world. We're going to need many, many more if we're actually going to solve the climate crisis in a time frame that protects our children and our children's children.
And I've read that you said that this Global Energy Alliance is basically modeled on Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And it could be a blueprint that could be applied to other areas like food or transportation or other areas. Where do you see this potentially being useful for? What areas in particular do you see coming next?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Gavi, because I think the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which is what Gavi stands for, is in fact a premier public-private partnership that needs to be even more active in ensuring that COVID-19 vaccines are reaching those people who live in vulnerable communities. And it was founded with the very simple idea that everyone everywhere, not just in wealthy countries, should have access to immunizations that will save lives and enable productive communities over time. The Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is founded on the same idea. You know, it shouldn't just be wealthy families driving kids around in Teslas in San Francisco or Paris. It should be renewable energy technology made available even to the most least fortunate communities, so they can lift themselves up and do it in a way that protects the planet. I think we desperately need a similar effort around food and agriculture. The Rockefeller Foundation has done a lot of work on the true cost of today's food systems. And the reality is our food systems are making us sick. They are causing a tremendous amount, the primary cause of long-term burden of disease for most populations on the planet. And at the same time, they're making our planet unsustainable. And so, you know, reducing animal agriculture, transitioning to regenerative agricultural production, and doing it in a way that improves human nutrition is another area that's ripe for large-scale public-private partnership that can actually change the world for the better.
You mentioned that the Global Energy Alliance is one way to deliver a global COVID charter. So can you just explain what this is and what does this involve? What are the commitments of this COVID charter?
Well, I have called for a global COVID charter, and it goes back to your first point, which was, during World War II, Churchill and Roosevelt gathered on a ship outside Newfoundland and said, what are the systems we can put in place to prevent a future conflict if we survive this one? How do we prevent World War III? And the answer was the creation of the Bretton Woods Institution, the investment in a global, and in this case for Western Europe, a Marshall Plan, in which allowed the United States to participate in the reconstruction of Western Europe. It was literally the creation of this field of global development cooperation that had at its core the concept that if you help others lift their living standards and join an integrated modern economy, you create incentives for peace, for prosperity, and for stability. And frankly, we lost our way in recent years. And so I've called for a COVID charter. That was called the Atlantic Charter. By the way, I've called for a COVID-19 charter. I think COVID-19 has yielded such death and destruction across the planet that it is a moment for real reflection. And we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to work together as a global community to lift everyone up and save our planet from the existential crisis of climate change? And we laid out a few simple steps. The first is countries around the world have to be more effective in their public administration and spending, and developing countries in particular have to collect more tax revenue and spend those resources on the types of efforts that lift up their people and protect our collective natural resources. The second is developed countries, wealthier nations, simply have to do more to share vaccines, to invest in global development. It calls for a 1% of GDP commitment to global development cooperation at this time of existential threat. The third step is we have to reimagine the Bretton Woods systems. We created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund nearly 70 plus years ago. The world has changed. We need a new architecture that's much more public-private. The fourth was embracing and asking for more public-private partnerships like the Global Energy Alliance. And the fifth, and by the way, those are necessary to embrace technology and innovation that usually only comes from the private sector, but making it available to everyone, everywhere. And the fifth and final step was just more political accountability. I had the benefit of running the U.S. Agency for International Development for President Obama, and I know that when you can show you're delivering real concrete results, you can win political support from conservatives and liberals, from faith-based religious activists to young people who know that we live in an interconnected world and want to be a part of it. We need that broad coalition. You can only do that by delivering results and being held accountable for measurement and reporting. So that's what a COVID charter could accomplish. But the most important thing it could accomplish is reimagining global cooperation at a time when that reimagining is desperately, desperately needed.
Dr. Rajiv Shah, unfortunately, we're already out of time, but we finished on a hopeful note, hopefully, in this end of year that is slightly uncertain, but hopefully with a better start for 2022. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening at the Conférence de Paris.
Thank you.